Okay, here we are with another Zoom presentation for Rise Volleyball Club. Today we are so fortunate to have the head coach at Washington University, Keegan Cook, joining us. And we're going to talk a little bit about the recruiting process and playing at the collegiate level and what that entails and the benefits of doing that and just kind of his experience of coaching at the highest level. So Keegan, thanks so much for joining us. We really appreciate you taking the time out of your schedule to meet with us and give a little feedback for our girls.
Yeah, good afternoon. Happy to be talking some volleyball here in a time we don't get to do a lot of it. And like I told you before, thanks for getting me out of some gardening chores that I'm supposed to be doing right now. But yeah, happy to reflect on the recruiting process. As your athletes may or may not know, I'm at the University of Washington in Seattle. Before that, I spent almost 10 years at St. Mary's College in Northern California and also coached club at a club called NorCal Volleyball. And so I've coached everything from 13s all the way up to where I am now and got to know a lot of athletes at every level of the game. So excited to talk about recruiting and how it affects all of them.
Absolutely. So, being that you have experience at multiple levels, especially being at St. Mary's and being at Washington, could you maybe just open up with speaking to a little bit of the difference between those two collegiate programs and how recruiting might work at St. Mary's versus Washington? I think one concern for the girls a lot of times is time frames. They always want to know, when should I be doing this? Am I too late to be starting the recruiting process? Does this school already have all their spots filled? So just the juxtaposition between those two schools, could you speak about how they're a little bit different?
Yeah, I think what we're going to find as we go through this conversation is that all levels of play have more things similar than they do different, surprisingly, is one thing I would say. I think we tend to try and group schools and classify schools by, whether they're Power 5 or a mid-major or D1, D2, D3. But the experience itself of being a collegiate student athlete and being committed to a program is always demanding at every level in every institution. And so, just talking about the two schools that I've worked at, I think the only thing that stood out to me was a little bit of the level of play. I think it's okay for me to say that the Pac-12 conference has been, slightly more competitive than the WCC, but I wouldn't say it makes it any easier. There's some tremendously talented coaches and players in the West Coast Conference, and I certainly felt as much stress coaching then as I do now. And so even that maybe isn't the best comparison. I got to do a little bit more when I was at a private school as an assistant coach. I felt like I had more responsibilities, whereas where I'm at Washington, I thought that there's a few more people to take over certain aspects of the program. So, when I was assistant coach at St. Mary's, I felt like I had my hands in everything, and I learned a ton when I was doing it. And when I got to Washington, there were times people would say, "Hey, don't do my job for me." People who, are passionate about equipment or athletic training or budget. Those things kind of got taken away. And so there's pluses and minuses to that. Working at St. Mary's was tremendously meaningful because I was involved in so many areas. At the same time, at Washington, I get to focus a little bit more on what I'm probably best at, which is volleyball. And so maybe that's a comparison. As far as the student athlete experience goes, I can't say that they're markedly different. There's certainly different types of schools in terms of size, and their travel schedule. But like I said before, the student athlete experience in itself is going to be demanding for all of our club athletes.
One thing that we talked about in an earlier meeting I did with a city college coach is, doing your research on just what you're talking about the demands of a school. So, in terms of those similarities and differences, there are certain notable differences that there might be between, let's say, like a really small NAIA school and what you're doing at the Division I level. And
yes.
I know I went to an NAIA school, and in the spring we had opportunities to go and study abroad, and we were encouraged by coaches to do that if we wanted to, even though we might. So their demands on us there were they wanted to have the best collegiate and competitive program that they could, but at the same time, there's different philosophies at different schools about the demands on players. And certainly
Hmm.
I know that if I had gone to another school and played at another program, that the demands would be different. And I think that's something that the girls want to consider. So how do you, how would you say, as a coach, if you're being interviewed, because I'm going to talk to my players a lot about really getting to know the coach and demands, what are some things that you want players to really understand about your program, so that they can be confident that they're making a good decision and it being a good fit to go with you?
Yeah, yeah. Good point. You know, the differences between divisions, you know, because of rules and because of, you know, how academics is valued, or where they want student athletes spending their time, is going to be different between the divisions. You know, between St. Mary's and Washington, we operate under the same rules. But when you're talking about Division two, Division three city colleges, now, you know, it's going to be a little bit more unique. So, you know, you're right about that. You know, I was thinking more along the line of, man, being on a team is an experience that I would want, you know, that I think is consistent across all levels of play. But to address your question more specifically, I think our club athletes need to know what the month by month demands are in terms of time. You know, in Division one, we have phases of time where we're allowed to have 20 hours per week, and we have phases per time where we're only allowed to have 8 hours per week. Knowing whether a school is a quarter school or a semester school, you know, knowing what some of the summer obligations are in terms of, is summer school expected, is working summer camp, you know, encouraged or expected. Those are some of the more minute details that I think your club athletes need to be really straightforward with when they're asking questions. Like you alluded to, is studying abroad allowed? Is that something that's encouraged? Can I have the majors that I want to have? Are there certain majors that don't work at this university because there aren't enough classes offered, or because of the way our practice times are? Those, again, I think are some details that your athletes can't be shy about, you know, because the two things that are going to affect their experience the most, the student side and the athlete side, and they both have to work. If one or the other doesn't work, they're not going to be very happy. And so those are some of the more, you know, minutia that I think they should be asking pretty directly, because it's going to vary a ton, even within the same conference, same level of play. You know, there's quarter schools and semester schools, and you know, you need to have a clear understanding of what you're getting into.
Yeah, no, that's great. And getting back a little bit to what you're talking about, you know, kind of the similarities as well between playing on a team collegially, no matter where you go, what division you play, there are going to be a lot of similarities. So what do you think are kind of, you know, you just talked about, you know, the two most important things about what's going to affect their experience. So no matter what level they're looking to play at, what are things that you think are important for them? You know, obviously they can't control necessarily who else gets recruited with them and who else is on the team. So there's going to be always, it's going to be on a coach to try to get his team or her team to gel the most so that it's a great experience, you know,
Mm-hmm.
for everybody. But what do you do as a coach, and what would you expect the girls to do to try to give them the best sense of whether or not they're going into a situation that is going to work for them and be a good fit for them?
Mm. Yeah, it would be nice if there was an exact science to it. You know, of course, there's not. I think the more effort you put in, the more likely you are to make an informed decision. You know, and then to make an accurate decision. One thing that's hard to predict is what it's like when you're there. You know, just no matter how many times I talk to a recruit, no matter how much I try and paint a picture of what their individual experience is going to be like, I won't know until they're in it. You know, and we stress so much, both coaches and athletes, about making the right pick. You know, we really try and pick the right situation. But a lot of it is, you know, what happens when you get there, you know, and how do you respond to some of the things that you knew were going to be challenges and some of the things you never saw coming, you know, and an athlete's ability to be flexible and resilient is more important than them doing an extra 20 hours of research, you know, with a really robust system to quote unquote pick the correct school. You know, I talk about this a lot, in that the NFL gets paid millions of dollars to try and pick the right players, and they get it wrong all the time, you know, because it's not about picking, it's about coaching and it's about learning. And so, you know, whenever I found my club athletes getting really overwhelmed by, you know, am I picking the right school, I would try and remind them, hey, this is the very first step of a very long process. Once you get to the school, that's when it all begins, and how you thrive in that environment, is the deal. It's not about making the right pick. That doesn't mean you can't make a very poor choice if you do no research and don't ask good questions and go against your intuition. I mean, that's an easy way to get yourself into a bad situation. But I worry sometimes that our athletes are so concerned about picking the right school that they forget that there's a lot of work to be done once you get there, and your success is more related to that than it is the pick you made when you were 15, 16, 17, 18. So, I mean, that's some thoughts on that.
Yeah, no, that's a great point, because I think sometimes if you are so sure of your pick and then it doesn't work out, it's almost even more deflating than if you went in kind of with the expectation that there's just no way this thing is going to go perfect. There's going to be some sort of resistance I'm going to face, whether it's a challenging relationship with a teammate, your classic maybe setter hitter relationship, or
Yeah.
or something like that, or your coach is a little different than you thought that they were going to be, or maybe you get a different coach like we talked about before.
Yeah.
You come in and you play 2 years at a school and all of a sudden there's a coaching change because like yourself, maybe you're out of St. Mary's and you get an offer to go play at a top 20 pro, or go coach at a top 20 program or something. Coaches are going to take those opportunities as they can to move up through the system, and girls need to understand that and kind of be prepared that those types of things can happen. I think in the way that I instruct the girls, that's where the academics comes in really heavily, because I'm always going to say, worst case scenario, you get to school, you play one season, and for whatever reason you can't play volleyball anymore, or you decide not to play volleyball anymore, are you still think that you'd be comfortable being at that school? And if the answer is not yes to that, you need to really do a deep dive in terms of that school. So I think we're kind of along the same lines in terms of what we're talking about in regards to that.
Yeah, I like that instruction. The other thing I would say is you mentioned this. Our athletes, even after they commit, they dream about college for 2-3 years, right? They build up all these dreams and expectations of what it's going to go like. When they show up, one of the first things I say is, there is no way I'm going to meet the expectations you've had of what this is going to be like. You've been dreaming about this for 2 years. I'm going to fall short, and it's going to fall short. This experience is going to be more difficult than you expected. It's not gonna, and that's not a sign that it's wrong, but because there's no way we can meet the expectations. Just like I've been dreaming about you playing here and all the things that would happen. Let's just kind of get to work once we get here. But that I think is a common problem. Athletes show up, it doesn't go like they dreamed, and the first thought that comes to their head is something's wrong. Well, there's nothing wrong. You're just in it now, and it's time to kind of get readjusted. So I like that you mentioned that about expectations and that they're pretty much impossible for us to meet. We're going to exceed some of them, and we're going to fall short of some of them, and that's just kind of, I think, natural.
Yeah, something I talk about with my players that I can't even remember where, to be honest, but it talked about mental toughness. I read something a long time ago about mental toughness and how we kind of put everything under the category of mental toughness, but maybe some things we should classify more as mental flexibility than mental toughness, because we think mental toughness, we think resilience, getting punched and knocked down and being able to come back. But then there's also another side of mental toughness, which is more mental flexibility, which is the scenario can change around me and I can adapt. And would you say that adaptability goes a long way in terms of a player's own control of their experience?
I think you're touching on something that we've been talking about for a couple of years here. Flexibility is the deal, and adaptability, because we're all really bad at predicting the future. Who of us would have predicted that we wouldn't be coaching volleyball right now? None of us. And so the people who are going to thrive, besides Bill Gates, the people who are going to thrive are the ones who adapt, and the ones who, they don't bemoan their situations. They just try and pivot and find another way around it. And that's even more appropriate for our athletes than it is for us, and maybe that's a great lesson of what we're going through right now. But I think about, our most successful players, and there's no question our most successful players were also our most flexible players and our most adaptable. I 3 or 4 All-Americans come to mind, kids who changed positions, kids who all went through injuries, kids who, struggled with just mental health. The number of adversities you face is hopefully not too much, but they're pretty much guaranteed that they're coming. That's probably the only thing we can guarantee. And the ones who are flexible and who have a good group of people helping them, would be my other piece of advice, are the ones that keep striving ahead and succeed.
Yeah, and that even happens for, I think of just because I've worked a lot with the Stanford program over the last 5 years and gotten to know John a lot and Kevin now, and gone up there during the summertime and worked a lot. So developed relationships with those players. And I look at what, Catherine Plummer went through with missing all that time. And you could almost make an argument that she might not have done what she did in the tournament had she not had all that rest, and just kept a positive mindset and go, I need my body to recover right now. And I know my team is struggling mid-season and we'd like to go into the tournament, being ranked number 1, but ultimately it is what it is. And I'm going to control the controllables. And then when she was able to hit the court, I mean, I watched it live. It was ridiculous. So,
yeah, no doubt. No.
So even I thought from the seemingly lowest level to the highest level, I do think that's that flexibility is super important for them. So speaking of flexible, I think that's a really good thing to be during the entire recruiting process, because I haven't had one single kid that I've helped along the way through the recruiting process that hasn't had an ebb and flow experience of how things go, and seeming like things are moving one direction and all of a sudden they pivot and go another direction, or there's seemingly like there's a lot of assurity of something happening, and then all of a sudden it doesn't seem like such a sure thing, and then it comes back. And so in terms of kind of their mentality of where they can be through the recruiting process, what would you say is kind of the most important thing for them to have as in terms of their mindset going through that?
Oh, good. Yeah, man, that's a really good question. What is the best mindset for them to have? The word that came to mind for me was like just having a vision, having a really concrete vision of what your end goal is, and the clearer that picture is of what you're seeking in terms of a student athlete experience at the next level, that you hang on to that. And as you mentioned, there's going to be some times when there's some good feedback from the schools you want to hear from. There's going to be long periods of silence where you're not hearing from people you want to hear from. And there's it's very easy to fall into this time where you're having these conversations with yourself where you're like, oh, I'm not good enough, or Keegan thinks this about me, or St. Mary's thinks this about me, and really you don't know that, but you're telling yourself that, and also you start telling yourself stories that aren't true. And we all have a tendency to do that, I think, in life, is when we don't have the concrete answers, when there is uncertainty, we make up some story, and it's never a good one, right? It's never like, oh man,
yeah, that's exactly what I'm speaking to. I feel like a lot of girls, like, ridiculous, or regardless of what level that they're at, because the higher level of a player you are, the higher level of a program you're probably dreaming of getting into. So everything kind of, is appropriate for that particular player, but just kind of some of the despair that they feel during the recruiting process. And ultimately, I think a reason why a number of girls quit the recruiting process, because they kind of have this imagination of how it's going to go, and then it doesn't. And they build up these stories. So, just patience, would you say, during the process, and understand there's going to be times where they don't hear from coaches. Like, you can speak from experience. There's times the kid's not going to hear from you, and it doesn't necessarily mean you're not interested. It just means that there's other things that you're doing.
Yeah, no, it's an interesting time for the kids that you're working with who are kind of at a recruitable age. We're trying to make this big shift with the rules, at least at the Division I level, where we are limiting the amount of contact, that we're allowed to have, and when we can actually start seriously doing some of the more, extensive recruiting things like visits or making offers or even talking on the phone, that calendar has shifted to slow things down. So you have current freshmen, sophomores, you know, who back when they were younger, they remember girls committing maybe, or, you know, getting serious about business at this age. And now they're not doing those things. And so there's an easy temptation to think I'm behind. But in reality, they're just in the middle of a transition. And this, I think when I talk with other college coaches, these, you know, next 2 or 3 recruiting classes, 21, 22, 23, they're kind of the transition group from an old recruiting timeline that I don't think was very healthy to hopefully a new recruiting timeline. And then on top of that, you know, these sophomores who are really itching to get going are not allowed to play right now. And so they're all really facing some adversities. But I think my mindset is everyone's going to make better decisions when they're making them a little older and a little bit later, you know, when they have more information. And so it'd be very easy to stress out right now if I was a sophomore, you know, or a junior in high school. But there was a time, you know, not too long ago when people were starting the recruiting process as seniors, you know, their very first thing, or as juniors. And that used to be normal in one day and age, and those people all turned out fine. And so, you know, I was talking to my sister as a club director the other day, and I said, we're going to be all right here. You know, these kids are going to, they're going to have more time to develop. They're going to have more time to look at schools. Coaches are going to have more time to look at them and make smart decisions. And that's the mindset that I'm approaching it with, you know, is we got a little time here. I know it doesn't feel like that when you're in it, but I really believe we're going to start making some better recruiting decisions from both our standpoint and the athlete's standpoint.
So what do you think then with the new recruiting guidelines? What are the timeframes that girls need to get, you know, really serious and build a schedule for themselves of consistently reaching out to coaches and you know, there's a lot of talk about video and, you know, how often, you know, you're going to have some of these recruiting coordinators around that get the girls to sign up, you know, with them for a fee, and they're putting out a new video every month, you know, that sort of stuff. Like what would your suggestion be there, and what's realistic for them to do? You know, obviously they need to do something. And I always tell girls that the amount of hard work that you put into your recruiting process is going to be directly proportional to how it goes for you. And I think for the most part, girls have come out of kind of that sense that somehow a coach is going to walk by their court and the lights are going to dim and a spotlight's going to shine on them and music's going to play and the coach is going to fall in love with them. And that's just not really the way that the recruiting process, you know, works necessarily. But touching on that, what, you know, timeframes and what's really important for them to do.
Yeah, I mean, I think getting the coach to your match or your practice has tremendous value. You know, there's no substitute for kind of seeing somebody live in person. You know, I wouldn't make a decision without that. You know, just so much gets communicated in a face-to-face conversation as opposed to an email or a text message. And so I do think there's a space for, you know, videos that demonstrate your abilities as a player, but I don't think they're as extensive as people think they need to be. You know, it's 2 minutes every 6 months would be enough, if I'm being honest, you know. So you send a video of your high school highlights and maybe a video of that season's club highlights. It's 2 to 3 minutes long. And the goal, of course, is to get us to show up, you know, to a match or to a practice. And then, you know, YouTube, of course, is what I suggest to people all the time, you know, something very simple and basic. And yeah, and then fire it off with a sincere letter, you know, that speaks to our university to let us know that it's not a mass email. You know, I think if I get an email from, you know, a mass email or, you know, one that it just says, "Dear Coach, you know, I love your school," but there's nothing that tells me that you know anything about Washington, I'm much less likely to pay attention to that letter as opposed to something that's more sincere.
We just talked about that in our last meeting, and one of the girls in our last meeting, she asked about how to let schools know that she's genuinely interested in them, and kind of how to know that a school that she wants is interested in her. And I said, details in the message coming from either direction probably communicate a lot of the interest. So if a school reaches out to you and says, "Hey, we're interested in you," and that's basically all the message, the email per se says, or whatever it might be, or you get an email that says, "We're interested in you and this is how we see you fitting into our program." Those are two very, very different communications in terms of the seriousness level of um, whether that coach is really interested in making an offer to you. And same from their side. If you communicate to a coach and they can see through your messaging to them that you put time into researching the school and can communicate to them how you see yourself fitting into the school, then that's going to differentiate them a little bit. I mean, do you think girls in general are doing a good job of that now, or do you still get a bunch of emails? I mean, if you want to just be as transparent as you can, but a bunch of emails where you're just kind of like, this doesn't really tell me anything, so I'll move on with my life, versus, emails that actually make you pause, or any sort of correspondence that make you pause and take an extra moment to evaluate a girl.
Yeah, and I would say less than 5% of all emails I receive include any sort of sincere messaging that would, give me pause. But when they do, every single time that I could tell that it wasn't written as a form or it's not from a recruiting service, I take the time to at least read it and know what's going on. But if it is mass mailed to me, or if there is any hint to me that it wasn't done with care and sincerity, then it's sent off somewhere else, to maybe get looked at by an intern or a group of people who can filter it out to help me find out the interest level of that athlete. So I like that as a rule of thumb. Details do imply interest, and thoughtful, sincere thought, in either direction certainly should come through in our messaging. You asked about like what's an important date. The rules are going to be different for every level. For us, June 15th is looking like a very important date because it's the first date that we're allowed to take phone calls or make phone calls or emails, for that matter, direct contact. June 15th of your sophomore year would be kind of probably the next big kind of landmark coming up. After that, August 1st is a big landmark. That's when visits can begin, unofficial or official, August 1st, heading into your junior year. So again, I think those right now are the two most important dates at the Division I level.
Got it. And I lost my train of thought for a second. If at different levels, as much as you can speak to them, do you think that generally those timeframes just kind of get pushed back? So if you're looking at lower level D1 or D2, that you're maybe looking at those unofficial or official visits more the summer before your senior year versus the summer of your junior year, kind of within your coaching network of of other coaches that do you have any kind of general idea of how those timeframes kind of spread out versus different levels?
Yeah, anecdotally, from people's comments to me in the Division II or Division III, that they'll say things like that, like, hey, I can't move forward until you make your decision, because they think there's this kind of domino effect that takes place. Right. So anecdotally, I think that might be true, but I would say there's other factors. How big is the recruiting class? That's a big deal. When you have to fill 3 or 4 scholarships, it takes you time to work through that, as opposed to filling 1 or 2 where you can kind of get on it a little earlier. Yeah. So there may be some anecdotal truth to that, I think. But there's other factors. What I told my club players and what I know now, having coached club and coached at 2 Division I schools, and having family members who played Division II and former club players who won national titles at the D3 level, is you've got some time, and coaches, at one point they may not have a spot for you, but if you reach a certain level of play, the opportunities, with your effort, of course, like you talked about, will show up. If you can play, you can play. And when it happens is not as important as that it does happen. I can't tell you how many players are being added to even Pac-12 rosters, in the senior year or in the last 6 months, or even in the transfer situation. If you just focus on what is in your sphere of influence as a player, you just stay in there. I know that you're gonna find your place, and it's not to say that you shouldn't make any effort. You have to make effort, but you need to make effort in the areas that you can control, and that's largely in your own development as a player, just happens all the time,
One quick question, because I thought it was a good question from one of my my players, is a program like a Pac-12 program is going to have a budget that allows their coaches to travel a lot. So you're going to get to go, I know when I see you at almost every big tournament that we go to. But there's a lot of coaches out there that have a very limited budget, and they have to very strategically pick, where and when they go. And so the reality for, let's say, a Southern California kid who wants to play collegiately and is looking at schools on the East Coast, there may be a situation where that coach doesn't ever get to see them live. Like, I agree with
Mm-hmm.
you that live is, there's no substitute for getting to watch a player live, especially since you get to see how they interact with their
Mm-hmm.
coaches and with their teammates. Or I even had a John Dunning told me one time that he was recruiting a girl, and long story short, he saw the way she treated her mom, and immediately was like, I don't want that kid. And
Mm-hmm.
so that's the sort of thing, had he not been there in person and just been going off of video, there's no way that he picks up on something like that. But
Right. Right.
having said that, there are limitations, and there are girls who are so if they're in that scenario, do you have any advice, for them, if they're in a spot where they're not going to be seen by the schools?
Mm.
Would you say it's just developing relationships with those coaches? Or
Yeah, I certainly, my own geographical bias and probably level of play doesn't tell the story of every university. There's probably coaches, things I know, there's far more universities in the East than the West at every single level. Just it's just a known fact that there's more schools out East than there are out West. Getting them to see you is a little bit more of a challenge when you were on a coast like us, in the Pacific Northwest or in Southern California. You might have the Triple Crown tournament. You might have some tournaments that are, more centrally located that help you. I've seen Southern California teams going out East more than ever before for some of those qualifiers for that reason, I think, to try and get seen by a different group of schools.
yeah, that's
But again, if you're sending small highlight videos, that's going to lead to a coach wanting to see a whole match, and so that should be the natural progression in my mind for a school that can't make the trip, to see you play at practice or see you play at a tournament. They're gonna request what they want. They're gonna see transcripts. They're gonna want to see whole matches. There will still be some things that you're sending their way to help them make that decision. But that's a good point. I don't want to speak too much to it because what do I know about being a coach in the Southeast? I
yeah.
don't know anything. They're gonna know more than me. But again, there are a ton of opportunities, on the East Coast and in the Midwest, and I think a lot of our players can find a home there for sure.
So just kind of segueing into that relationship with the coach of the program that you're looking for. Just, you can go either way on this. Do you think that there's a certain mindset that a player can have, like we talked about with the mental flexibility, where they could go into almost any situation and flourish? Or do you think there are certain dynamics between a player and a coach, and how a coach operates, maybe their demeanor or their coaching style? That encompasses a lot of things.
Yeah.
But how big of a factor do you think that is in terms of their experience, besides academics and their interactions with their teammates and other
Mm.
students at school, which is going to impact their experience the most?
Yeah, that's really big.
Maybe I should say it this way: do you have a certain do you look for certain personality traits, or just sense of whether or not a girl will do well under your particular coaching style, or
Mhm.
or do you think that as long as they're ready to learn and have a good attitude, that things will go well?
Mm. Yeah, that's such a good question on so many levels. So certainly there was a time when I started to find myself recruiting the same personality player, and then what I realized is something I valued on my teams was diversity.
Mm.
In terms of just who they are and how they play the game and what their just what their personality is. So now I try and on purpose look for a wider range of people than I used to. I think I used to be kind of narrowly focused on just kind of one type of athlete that I liked working with because I thought it connected well with me. But now I find myself seeking and trying to be more open-minded about the kinds of players that I'm able to work with. But that's me. For a student athlete, they need to decide what their non-negotiables are. What do I know about myself from my experiences of being coached by different high school or club coaches that works and does not work for me. And I think that that's important.
Have you
you
had
know.
any girls ask you those sorts of questions where when they asked you, you kind of thought like, wow, that's a really smart question for them to ask of me in order for them to get a
Mm,
sense of that?
man, they ask me hard questions all the time. No, I don't know. Yeah. I'm trying to think if I can think of any in particular where it really
I
stumped
mean,
me.
it might be a
Um,
good question just to put out there what you said. Do you as a coach value diversity and personalities on the team? Do you feel like the team is constructed of girls that come from a lot of different backgrounds that bring a lot of different things to the table, or do you feel like you kind of want everyone to have kind of the same mindset, or the same general way that they go about things? Because I'm kind of like you. I think that um, I think one of the good things that we've been able to do in our club is we have a number of high schools around, and we've been able in our area to get our top teams to be a collaboration of
mhm,
girls that come from a lot of different places.
mhm,
So, in my experience, I find that if I have let's say I have a team that's heavily populated by uh, like one school, and another school, then I have this potential for there to be kind of this segmented aspect to my team. Whereas if I
mhm,
have 11 girls, my ideal team would be 11 girls from 11 different schools, from 11 different backgrounds, so that when they come
mhm,
together as a unit, that's its own special entity. It's not,
mhm.
a pocket of three or four of this type, or three or four of that type. And if you can get them to bond, I feel like some of my most successful teams, um, have done that. It doesn't always work
Mhm.
out
Yeah, I
that way.
love that as a strategy. Here's a question that you can give your kids that I think will be helpful is to go up to a college coach and say, who has done well here? What student athlete has done well at your institution and why do you think they did well? And I think in that moment you're going to hear from that coach about the kind of athlete that they like to coach, about what they think it takes to succeed, and what that athlete had from a character standpoint that allowed them to succeed. I think you're going to get very different answers when you ask that question. But you know, who came in here, what was she like, and why did she have success at your institution? Because ultimately, that's what we all want. Want them to be successful. So I think that that's a question that athletes should pose towards, because if they describe an athlete who's nothing like you, or who plays the game a lot different than you, then maybe you're like, oh no, this is not what I want. Um, so I think that's important. Maybe you asked what is something that we look for. I don't want an athlete who is setting getting to Washington as their biggest goal. And maybe I would say that in general, it would be good advice for club players is it's a new beginning, in some feels like a big goal, and maybe it's the highest level of volleyball that the player ever aspires to, but it shouldn't be the highest thing they aspire to in life. We want to work with people who are viewing their 4 years at Washington as a time to grow so that they can go on and have the career they want or play professionally or play on the national team, whatever it may be. But this shouldn't be kind of an end point. If it is, it's going to be a problem. If you show up and it's like, oh yeah, I made it, it's not going to go well. You need to be, again, energetic and ready to begin a new process. And
Yeah.
I would say that needs to be the same for any student athlete, when they get
What's
to
that
college.
commercial that's like, you know, there's this many collegiate athletes in our country, and 99% of them are going pro and something else, basically.
Yeah.
So
Yeah. Yeah. You got to be in, you got to be of that mindset. If you've got like arriving is like the deal and you put that jersey on and you've made it, you got a lot more time to spend, where it's not going to be, it's not going to go well, I don't think.
yeah, and I think that that speaks to a little bit as well of knowing the school, and whether or not you want to be there outside of volleyball, and being as sure of that as you can be. Also, understanding kind of philosophically what schools are, because I think at the highest level, it may seem like it's a little tough to differentiate between, let's say, what Washington's philosophy is as an institution and what UCLA's philosophy
Yeah.
is as an institution. But also for me, coming from an NAIA level, I went to a liberal arts college,
Hmm.
and that liberal arts philosophy was very pervasive in terms of how our curriculum was developed, what classes we were instructed, to take. And I see value from that going on in my life, because basically, to sum up, they want you to know a little bit about everything and being able
Mm-hmm.
to articulate yourself across almost any subject that would come at you, and be able to speak to it and understand it. And I found that to be a very useful thing for me in life, coming from that particular perspective. So I think at a school like Washington, it's not going to be the same as my experience going to a tiny liberal arts college, but it could
Right.
be whatever path you want to take, whatever major you think you want to have, having an understanding of what that major's philosophy is, and kind of how you feel like you're going to develop in that program, and
Mm-hmm.
knowing that, and understanding, it sounds like what you're saying, that maybe is more important than even how you're going to fit into the volleyball program,
Yeah.
necessarily.
We call it, what I like to call it, you better have your why. You better know what your why is, because like when things get difficult, you're going to ask yourself, why am I here? Why am I going through this? And the answer might be, well, I'm going through this because I love the game. Great. That's a good why. Or it could be, you know what? I am so passionate about becoming an architect, and this is the best school for being an architect. And I know that. And when things are hard, I'm going to hang on to that. I'm going to push through. But if your why is a little flimsy, if you look back and go, why am I here? And you can't answer that question pretty quickly, then I think you're going to, be susceptible to some more difficult thoughts, So
Yeah,
I
certainly a
think,
lot to consider, and like in a good way and a bad way. There's so many different directions to go. Or I know you met my
yeah,
daughter a little while ago, but she draws every day and loves art, and she's so little now, who knows what's going to happen. But I told her there's art schools with volleyball programs. You
yeah,
could go play volleyball at an art school, and get to become an artist basically on their dime, because you play volleyball for them. And that might be some kids' motivation, is not necessarily to they could maybe in theory play at a higher level program if you're just looking at D1, D2 as those sort of categories, but also understanding that going forward, and understanding your experience. And maybe there's differences. I had a player a couple years ago who was choosing between a D1. She wants to be a nurse, and there was a D1 program that was offering her, and they had a nursing program. Was not super jazzed or super sold on going there, but she'd get to play at a really high level, and she would essentially get to come out with a nursing degree, when it was all said and done. But then there was
yeah,
another school that she felt like was much more kind of had the community that she wanted, and she saw herself fitting there more. She ultimately, I didn't know what to, I like, you got two tough choices, one very, with a very logical path, and the other one kind of, more going off of what you want your experience to be in college. And she made her decision, and she's having a great time. But she put a lot of time and effort into that decision, because she had two essentially really good paths to go. She couldn't make
yeah,
a wrong choice.
yeah.
She just had to kind of at some point pick one. And then I think too, best advice my dad has ever given me is, committing's the hard part, because once you do the committing, then all that's left is to make it work. And then you can just go to work on making things happen, and making things turn out to the best and how you want them, because you're not hemming and hawing the whole time, basically, about what to do. So kind of last thing I would say is just, overall collegiately, playing at the collegiate level in general, and with your experience having girls come through, what would you say kind of motivationally, maybe, to play at the collegiate level? What do you see are kind of like, the main, either the three main things, or just kind of the main things that you see that you feel like, it was a great decision for this player to play at this level, aside from just the aspiration of playing volleyball at the highest level, but kind of what you get out of the entire experience, would you say?
Yeah. What are some things I would recommend to your kids? I always think there's something to be said for putting yourself with the right amount of discomfort. The right amount of discomfort leads to some pretty special growth. If you don't have any discomfort, then you're going to be pretty bored. and you put yourself in a situation where the discomfort is just way too far above you, then you're going to lose confidence, and it's not going to be an experience. I think there's this little butter zone, where you're just uncomfortable enough that you're growing, and that you can reach some standards where at one point not within your reach, but then with hard work and effort, you get there, So I think that would be an environment that I would want for an athlete. Hey, get yourself just a little bit where you feel like, oh man, I don't know if I can do this, but you can, and you have to grow into it. The other thing I hear all the time is, recruits will say, I want to play at the highest level. I want to play at the highest level. And there's nothing wrong with that statement. But what I want to say to them is, you want to have the most meaningful experience you can. You want your career to mean something, you want to go through it in a way where, yes, you're playing at the highest level possible, highest level that you can play, but you also want it to have tremendous meaning. How many people can you affect, in your community on campus? How deeply involved can you be with your team and your institution? Like, that is the good stuff, and it happens at every level of the game. Kids really commit themselves to where they are, and they have this really fulfilling experience. I mean, that's the good stuff. It's not just about level of play all the time. It's about, how you go about it. I have a number of athletes. I can think of one who was really highly recruited, went to a Division I school, really high level. It was not what she wanted. So she went down to a Division III, and she still could have played at all those same Division I schools, but she found her home at a Division III school. She won a national championship, and she loved it, And so, just think you gotta, asking yourself questions is never going to lead you down a bad path.
Yeah.
Who am I? What do I want? What are my strengths? That's never going to lead you to bad life choices, And so I would encourage athletes to do a lot of self questioning and self-knowledge finding, So.
Yeah, no, I agree. And something that, that I think is, the coaches and I talk about this a lot, and we, it's obviously on a case by case basis, but kind of talking about what you're saying about how much is the resistance going to be, is it unbearable resistance that you're going to meet when you go there, or is it something that you can manage? And I think something for our highest level players in our areas, if you're the best player in our area, you've got to make that transition. If you get recruited at a high level school, you're going to go basically from being the bee's knees where you come from to being, just shoulder to shoulder at best, maybe with everyone around you where you go. And are you going to be able to cope with that? Or maybe worst case scenario, go back to square one and, go there thinking you're going to play your freshman year, only to have the coach tell you that they think you should redshirt your freshman year, and you don't see the court till your junior year, and, stuff like very, very common things that happen to girls, at that level. But certainly asking yourself, and knowing yourself in that regard, because I think, like we said, there's so many different ways that it can go, and a girl could go into a situation like that and thrive and be totally fine, and another girl could go into a situation like that and be devastated by it and realize that, maybe she should rethink what she really wants and what's best for her and what fits her personality the best, and find another fit for her somewhere else or something like that. So
no doubt.
Absolutely.
Hey, right, thanks for your time. I gotta go run and garden, but I appreciate
to cleaning out the garage. But I really appreciate you taking the time, and sure to see you at some tournaments hopefully soon.
Yes, sir. Hopefully soon. Be safe.
Okay. Thanks, Keegan.
All right. Bye.